Hi, I'm Ronit Plank, and I'm the only Jewish woman who was raised on a kibbutz, talking about what it's like post October 7th.
I am Laura Cathcart Robbins, and this is the only one in the room, but I am never the only one in this room because, as usual, my boyfriend, producer, and co host, Scott Slaughter, is who I call Hun, is here as well.
Hi, honey. You sound like you maybe haven't done that in a minute.
I haven't, I have, but I forget. Like when I say it in the wrong order, I get tripped up and then I forget to call you Hun.
Yeah, the room is
Um,
getting crowded, by the way.
The room
We're,
is getting, well,
uh-huh.
actually, I am the only one in the room right now because I'm in my office and you're upstairs. But we are talking today to Ronit Plank, who is not in our house with us.
No, she's not.
She is coming to us from the Seattle
Not that I
area.
wouldn't want to be there with you,
I
but
know, Ronit. We'd love to have you here next time you're in LA. Ronit is, so let me just tell you, she's an award-winning writer, editor, podcaster, teacher, and she's a previous guest of ours. And honey, maybe at some point you can, during the interview, you can tell me what season she was in because I forgot. But
Oh, yeah, I'll find it.
a really, really beautiful story. Ronit also beautifully moderated my stash dinner conversation in Seattle. That was, people, or I say I've met all these people since I've been a podcaster and an author and a writer, but a lot of them I've only met online. And so to fly to Seattle, one, have Ronit agree to do this, and then to see her in person was such a thrill. When I first saw you, I'm sure I screamed. And you're tall, which was the other
yeah,
thing.
you're tall too.
Yeah, I think of everybody as short. So whenever anybody's my height or over, I'm thrilled.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And it's really funny when you realize I haven't met you in person before, but we know
Yeah,
each other in different ways and over a period of time now where I forgot about that.
exactly. Exactly. And it feels like we know each other. Like, oh, yeah, I know Ronit. But to meet someone in person, which was not something that was really like, it wasn't common prior to the pandemic.
Mm-mm.
I had a writing
No.
group that I'd only met over Zoom. And so
Mhm.
that was an anomaly, right? That was a rare thing to have a group of people that, so yeah, it was really cool. And I know, Hun, I came back and told you about that day and how cool it was to see
I know.
Ronit.
I'm sorry I missed that one.
Yeah. And
It
Sarah
was so
Dean.
great to have you here in Seattle, and it was just wonderful, and to have our connections with Sarah Dean from
Yes.
Shameless Mom Academy, like all of the connections and the way that we were able to work together in that way after collaborating in other ways is lovely.
It really was. And I've said on this podcast, and I'll say it again, all roads lead to Sarah Dean. I just do. And I just love her. I never say her first name without her last.
Oh yeah,
But I just love her so much. And she's such an amazing connector.
yeah, she is.
Um, so you have this gorgeous website, Ronit. I don't think I've been on it for a
Oh,
while.
thank you. That's so
Is it
nice of
new?
you. No, it's not new. I think we've been adding things to it, and actually, my web manager and I are about to overhaul some things to make it a little bit better and a little more agile. I really appreciate that. I really lean heavy into the orange, as you know.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
like, I thought maybe I need to tone down the orange a little bit, but it's sort of become a theme color because I use it for, well, it's the cover of When She Comes Back, the memoir, and it's the splash of color I use for my oh my gosh, you're so beautiful. Thank you for having that there. And it's also what I use for my podcast, Let's Talk Memoir. Orange has just become sort of a highlighting color, which is ironic since it was the chosen color for some time of my mom's guru. So I feel like I've taken
Ah,
back
that's
the
right.
orange. I've taken back the orange.
Hun, do you remember watching that documentary about the guru? Wild, what was it
Wild,
called?
wild country.
Wild
I
Wild
do.
Country.
It was awesome.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
was.
I love that kind of stuff.
Me
Yes,
too. You
yes.
can say it's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was well done and it was really informative. And I've seen a lot of documentaries that don't interest me, but that one kept my interest all the way through.
I'm a big
Yeah.
fan of like, I love to see people getting themselves into trouble. I love people becoming drunk with power, trying to
Mm.
manipulate people, and then getting their comeuppance. It's one of my favorite
Mm,
things.
big fan of justice.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, and it's good when that person is an egomaniac, because then there might be footage of the whole thing because they want to
Hmm.
be filmed.
There
Right.
often is. You just cannot believe they record things, they wiretap, they basically document everything, they videotape
Yes.
everything. You're right. The narcissism gets them into trouble.
Yes. And just back to Let's Talk About Memoir. Fantastic podcast. If you listeners, if you are a fan of podcasts, and if you are a fan of memoirs, which I am, that's my first love. I'll read a memoir over anything, almost any day of the week. And Ronit really beautifully interviews memoirists about not only their memoir and their lives, but about the craft. It's a fantastic. I've been a guest
Yes,
on
you
Let's Talk
have.
About
Oh,
Memoir, and
I loved having you on Let's Talk Memoir. I was so excited to get that early copy of Stash and to know that I got like that we were going to do this together after doing your
yes,
show together. Beautiful. And
yeah.
I started the show as a limited series. I thought, let me see if I want to do this type of concentrated niche podcast. And it just sort of grew arms or legs or whatever you want to call it. I'm very bad at idioms and those expressions, but it's just created like its own life, and I feel like for a very small niche market, it just has a lot of goodwill and a lot of beautiful community and beautiful memoirists and writing teachers who have agreed to be my guests. So I just love doing it, and I'm so glad you like it.
Oh, I love it, and I recommend it all the time. And in fact, when people are looking at writing their own memoir, I get screenshots of my appearance on your show because they're researching
Oh, that's so
podcasts
great.
that talk about memoir, and they're like, "Hey, I found you on this." And I'm like, "Yes, that's my friend Ronit."
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that there's that community, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, memoirists.
Yeah.
I feel like memoirists make some of the best friends.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And
Yeah.
we're already able to be vulnerable, right?
Hmm.
That's why we have a memoir. So we
Yes.
have like those connections that are deeper, I think, because of
Yes.
that intimacy. So your memoir, we talked about that a little bit before we started recording. Aside from being a delicious read, I'm going to hold it up again.
Thank
It's
you.
beautiful. And there's a picture of Ronita and her mom here in the back. You always had that gorgeous hair.
Thank you.
Your hair
I
is
could say
just
the
like
same thing
ridiculous.
about you.
Oh, thank you.
And actually, Colin, my husband, would say the same thing about you, Scott.
Oh, yes.
He's not as he's not as gifted in that department these days.
It,
So he
it's a
would look at
gift, though,
Scott
isn't
and
it?
he'd say, "Great hair."
Yeah,
That's I'm glad I have something great.
I love that.
Uh-huh.
So, but I was telling you, I wanted to talk to you because on October 7th of 2023, I heard the word kibbutz more than I've ever heard it before. It was said in every newscast during every interview. And if it weren't for you writing about your time
Mm-hmm.
at the kibbutz Lahav, right? That's how you pronounce
Mm-hmm.
it.
Exactly.
I wouldn't have had much context for it. I wouldn't have understood what that life looked like. And I want to talk to you about so many things. I want to talk to you about the 7th and how you felt and the aftermath, the spread of anti-Semitism, the role of Jewish people in the civil rights movement, the viewpoint of Black Americans on what's happening now. But I want to start with your experience. You said in the chapter Sabra,
Mm-hmm.
when she comes back, that your kibbutz was like Eden, and you describe feeling safe there. So
Mm-hmm.
could you talk to us about what that was like and describe your time
Mm-hmm.
there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the plural in Hebrew of a kibbutz is a kibbutzim, and the kibbutzim used to be, that's plural, socialist communal work farms where people who lived there did the work on the land or in the factory or raising the animals. And it was sort of like a closed loop, and you didn't pay rent. Your kids were taken care of communally. and you did the labor of the farm basically and helped the country thrive and provide the resources. So that was the ideal. That was what it was supposed to be like. When I was there back, my parents went there from New York. They moved to Israel in the late 60s, had me and my sister in the 70s. And they moved there to make aliyah. And that literally means like to go up. It means to go to a higher place, which is basically to go to the homeland and to live there. And their plan was to stay there for a long time. They gave me a Hebrew name, as you can hear, Ronit, and they gave my sister a Hebrew name as well. And I spent most of my days in a children's house with my children's group, eating meals with my children friends, like in the same group as me, and saw my parents a couple of hours a day when the adults would take a rest. So in the afternoons, we'd sit on a hill, have fruit and cookies and drink tea. That was when the parents could just rest. The kids saw them, and it was just a beautiful kind of pastoral time. Then at night, as a baby and as a toddler, I went back to the children's home, and I slept in a big room with all my baby friends. And it was like preschool, right? And when I first wrote the book, it dawned on me how much separation I had from my parents and how the attachment to my mother and father was so different. And my independence was so strong because I was plucky by nature, but also that happened to be something that got strengthened by my ability to walk anywhere I needed and to navigate the world for myself without my parents there, with
Yeah.
just sort of like counselors and teachers to guide me. So our kibbutz was in the south by the Negev desert near Beersheba. And we raised wheat, and there were cows, and there were turkeys, and there were horses that you could ride, and baby goats. And my father also took me to see all these animals. And I grew up thinking of myself as an Israeli girl. My first language was Hebrew. That's all I knew. And my dad and mom planned it that way. My dad uh, was in the reserves of the army, and we were there during the Yom Kippur War. And there was this sense of farming the land, creating a place to live, and a homeland for the Jews in Israel. And when I moved, I was in grade school. We moved to Seattle, and I became an American. And growing up, my father worked for nonprofit companies that helped educate Jews around the world. And my orientation was of a Jewish girl in the New York area. Now, I realize I've gone a lot farther. You asked me about the kibbutz, and so I want to be able to stop there and see if you have questions about that before we move out.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for all that. I think that really gives a really full picture. Like, Hun, do you feel like you could cinematically picture what Ronit was describing?
I mean, much more than I've ever. I did not grow up around exposure to the depths of the Jewish community. So words like kibbutz didn't have meaning, and I still think a lot of people it is something we think we ought to know about, um, but we don't. So it's kind of hard to admit it. And I think this recent time has really made me want to look at what I do understand and don't understand, and
Yeah.
have a real opinion about it. But yeah, I think you painted a nice picture of something that I would oversimplify just out of being uncomfortable with me. Like, oh yeah, I know what that is.
Sure. I mean, for me, what I knew about a kibbutz before was that it was a farm
Mm-hmm.
and a commune, which
Yeah.
for me had a negative connotation. It's like hippies who don't work for a living and they,
Yeah.
like,
Uh-huh.
and so when I first read your description, before I heard you talk about it, at first I was a little horrified that the kids
Yeah.
spent so little time not on their own, but without their parents. And then you have like a mini scene in there where your dad like defies the rest of the kibbutz and like insists on having you with him for a meal or something.
Yeah.
And I get that there was this push pull for them too. It wasn't just like, oh, we're going to drop off the kids and
Yeah.
we don't care if we don't see them, only a couple hours a day. There was this call so that everyone could work, right? The adults could work.
Yes, and actually, I'm glad you said that, Laura, because one of the reasons, so I've gone through so many different emotions about this as I wrote the book, and even now, a couple of years after the book came out, I have had moments of thinking, whoa, what kind of attachment did I have to my parents when it was ruptured that way? And they didn't end up being the only people that I turned to. They didn't watch me in my most intimate moments with my friends or growing and learning. But my father always said that the reason the kibbutzim were so promoted was because it would free the women up as much as the men, and it was a more
Yes.
feminist way to raise families. And that the
Right.
men who worked in the city, for example, never saw their children. They didn't even get that concentrated 2 hours a day to spend with their families.
Mm-hmm.
And the other idea too is that, like, the women, they could work on the kibbutz, they could work in the kitchen, they could work, in the fields, they could work in the factories, and they took turns whether they were
Yeah.
going to teach the kids or feed the kids or whatever they were doing. So it was equitable. But there were negatives, like if my father got a record player from the States, he wasn't supposed to have it in his in our flat. It was supposed to be shared.
Mm.
Or if money that he made as a teacher had to go back to the kibbutz. Now
Right.
these days kibbutzim are privatized. I think they're all privatized, and so you live there and you pay rent, you can work elsewhere. And we went to visit my kibbutz back when I took my kids and my husband a couple of years ago, and it was still there. The pool that I swam in was still there, and it was really something to see.
Wow. Wow. So, Fritz, I want to thank you for all of that. And I hope that everyone who's listening gets this picture of you growing up there, um, and the Edenness of it, and also just the reality of it. And I love the equity of it.
Mm,
The idea that both parents have equal stake in both raising the children and working to support this community.
mhm,
But I want to know now. Tell me about October 7th and
mhm.
what I don't know if you can, in a short period of time, articulate the emotions you felt. But just tell me the beginnings of it, the first thing that
Sure.
happened when you heard about it.
Thank you. So I woke up early and I saw on Page Six, a celebrity website, that a Bruno Mars concert had been attacked, or there was a terrorist attack in a Bruno Mars concert in Israel. And I was like, whoa, what? That was the first thing I heard. And
Mm.
then as I started to look at the news, things started to come out. And I spent the first couple of days, if not the first couple of weeks, kind of glued to the news the way we do in this trauma filled world where the next big wave happens and we sit there and, for me at least, I'm hoping I'm going to hear something different, or I'm hoping something will happen to make it less horrifying. And so for me, the first early days were unbelievable to think that Israel had been breached this way and so many Israelis had died. I think it was 1,200 people were killed, slaughtered. And I don't know how much detail you want to get into on the podcast. I don't know how people understand what exactly happened, but there were war crimes. There was so many war crimes committed by Hamas. And I really want to distinguish that I'm very clear that Palestinians are not Hamas. The people who live in Gaza are not Hamas. There is Hamas in Gaza. And so when I
Right.
speak about the atrocities of that day and the horror committed by Hamas, and Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I can get into all of that. Islam and Islamism are very different. I can get into all of that. But basically, um, they came in, they breached this very potentially tough border between Israel and Gaza. And the problem with this is, aside from the loss of life, the loss of safety, the loss of a potential peace agreement, because a lot of the people who lived in the kibbutzim right there that were attacked were actively working on peace solutions for Palestinians and Israelis.
Mm.
Um, you get this sense of shock, utter devastation and shock, because something that we were raised on as Israelis and Jews, I think, is that Israel's strong, that Israel's fought off all of the countries around it, all of the nations that want to dispose of Israel and drive all the Jews into the sea. has constantly fought them back, has been successful and survived. This is what I grew up on. Now, I realize a lot of listeners are not Jewish. A lot of people don't have Jewish fathers who worked for Jewish nonprofits, who took the family with their mom to Israel to cultivate the land and have a Jewish upbringing. I understand that a kibbutz can seem so foreign, but understand that before I consider myself a Jew, I consider myself a human being. And after human being status, I consider myself a woman and a mother and an American and a feminist and an artist and a writer who happens to be Jewish. So many people, our identities and our labels are what people give us. They're not what we necessarily go around the world with as a label for ourselves, unless people call attention to it.
Right.
So I do feel very much like you, like anyone who is listening. However, I'm constantly reminded, as many marginalized or minority groups are reminded, that they are different. And the differences come up in funny ways sometimes, but also in dangerous ways sometimes. And unfortunately, this is a very strange thing to say, but after the attacks, I felt very much like Israel finally had the world's ear, because we hadn't done anything. Netanyahu hadn't done anything too egregious, right? In the recent past. And then what happened when Israel struck back, trying to get its hostages back, trying to push back against this terrible attack and insecurity and wreckage and death, then public opinion started to come for Israel. And I will mention that, unfortunately, and we can get into the Hamas thing, people were turning against Israel or saying Israel had it coming before Israel even started its, return fire on Gaza. And that speaks to how no other people get questioned about their right to exist the way that Jews do or Israelis do. And that people are often very progressive, except when it comes to Jews in Israel. And what I really want to say, no matter what I see on social media, and I interact with people from all different backgrounds. In fact, one of my friends who is on the podcast, Jasmine Falk Dickerson, who is a EDI trainer, diversity, equity, inclusion, she told me that the term anti-Semitism, she thanked me for a post I had on my story. And she said, the word anti-Semitism isn't even accurate because Arabs are Semites as well. So, not that words are the only thing at stake here, obviously, but she was talking about the misinformation and the way people get these buzzwords and people just grab on to the things that they hear. And I would say that thinking Israel is like, all Israelis are like Netanyahu and the military action he's taking is like thinking all Americans are like Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And if you judged our country on Trump's actions and behavior, you would absolutely be appalled by all Americans. But that's kind of the difference,
Yeah. I'm so grateful that you're willing to have this conversation with me. Thank you. Because I thought about this. I mean, Scott and I talked about it a bunch. I said, I want to have this conversation. I don't know exactly who to have the conversation with. And we thought of a few different women that are in our circle that I could have. And then I actually woke up at like 4:00 in the morning one day and I was like, Ronit is who I need to have this conversation with. And boy, are you the right person. So thank you. I really want to thank you for that. And
well, I want to thank you for asking me. And I will also reveal that I was a little bit nervous because, I'm just one person and I don't want to speak for all Jews. And, what is the expression? You get two Jews in a room and you have 5 opinions, or it's something like that. Like that's absolutely, and I may be exaggerating, but that's the thing, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't claim to speak for all Jews or Israelis. And I do want to say that there are people on the left and the right side of me. There are people who have disagreed with some of what I share on social media. There are people who thank me and message me. And there are people who say, why would you get involved in this on social media? Don't make yourself vulnerable. You're not going to fight anything or change anything this way. But I feel like because Jews are just 0.2% of the world's population, think about that. That's 0.2%. That's it. I feel like I'm not an inflammatory person. I'm not a confrontational or pugnacious person most of the time, but I feel like it's my duty to at least reflect back what I see as truth. And I think that Dara Horn wrote this book. It's called People Love Dead Jews. She's Jewish. She can say that. And it's actually funny. My husband was reading it in bed, cracking up, which was very strange. And I'm reading it now. But one of the things that she talks about very much in the beginning is that she, as a kid, was overwhelmed by the reality. I'm quoting, I have it right here. Overwhelmed by the reality of being part of a ridiculously small minority that nonetheless played a behemoth role in other people's imagination. And, you know, anti-Semitism, which we can talk about, is known as the world's oldest hatred. It's bigotry, prejudice, discrimination of Jews based on religion, culture, or ethnicity. And Jews are not just a religion, of course. It's an everything, right? It's a long story. We can get into that. So let me hand the mic back to you, but I just wanted to tell you that some of the Jewish friends that I asked, hey, do you want to participate? I will be anonymous about you. I will share what you think and what your thoughts are about what I'm going to talk about. And some didn't want to say anything. Some sent me some things that I can share here. And I will say, when I sat on October 7th at a show with a friend, a Jewish friend of mine, we weren't going to go, but we had tickets. She said, let's just go. I was like, what am I going to do? I feel so vulnerable. I feel like a rabbit in a wide open field with falcons and like hawks circling. Like, you just feel like, do I look Jewish today? But I think that I sat in the seat and I said, why do people hate Jews? Like, what's going on? And she said, I really think it goes back to the whole Jesus thing. I really think it's because people feel like, what happened in the Bible, in the New Testament is true. And that, like, the Romans had no part of it. It was just the Jews who did this to Jesus. And so I'm not sure. There's a lot of history there. I'm not an expert, but I just want to say that all of her progressive friends, all of the friends she's followed for so long and promoted and everything, she had to unfollow because they were just carte blanche spouting out Al Jazeera facts. And so she just unfollowed everyone.
Al Jazeera, the Arabic news source station. I appreciate all of that. And, I should also say, for the purpose of this conversation, that my children are Jewish. My ex-husband's Jewish. My children went to Jewish preschool. They were bar mitzvahed. They were baby named in temple. They have Jewish Hebrew names. So when the October 7th attack happened, people contacted me and said, how are the boys? Are they okay? Are they okay? And that really surprised me because my children are Black presenting. They don't present as, they could be biracial, but they could also just be Black. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't know their Jewish heritage. So there were a lot of people who that contacted me. And it really made me take a step back and think about where I was in all of this. And what I felt, and I think I can speak for Scott here too, what I felt the day of October 7th, when these horrific images were coming in, I was horrified. I was horrified by the fact that these were Jewish families who were just living their lives, who were attacked. I was amazed that everybody had safe rooms. Like, I didn't know that everybody had a safe room there and a panic room. And thank God, because it saved a lot of people's lives that day. And so all these things were kind of percolating within me. I didn't think about it could have been my kids, although my kids were going to take their birthright trip to Israel at some point. And it wasn't a good year. And then one of them, and they just never did it. But we were gearing up for that. And I thought I would go with them if they did, because how cool would it be to see Israel? And so there's these, what feels like in my head, like close calls, like we could have been there then. We could have had, some experience there, and we don't. not in Israel, but I definitely have experience in the Jewish community, even though I'm not part of it per se.
I feel like you have a lot of experience. I mean, I read your book, but I totally forgot. I guess I compartmentalized for this conversation. I forgot. Like I knew this. I mean, I've talked about you and I've mentioned you were married to a Jewish man. I know this,
Mm-hmm.
but I completely forgot that we have this other intersection.
Yes, yes. And it's a part of who I am, you know, and it will always be a part of who I am because it's my children.
Yeah.
And whatever that looks like. Oops, hold on a second. Um, so that I wanted to talk to you about two more things.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk to you about the role that Jewish people played in the civil rights movement here in America. At that time, you were talking about it first, the 60s and the
Yeah.
70s. And then I just wanted to, make mention from my point of view, every single picture that I've seen. I was born in the 60s, but I don't remember it. I do remember the 70s, but every picture
Mm.
that I've seen of that movement, there are Black people either arm in arm or hand holding or walking side by side with rabbis and people of the, that are Jewish. There are Jewish
Mm.
people, a lot of rabbis though, yarmulke wearing
Yeah.
with men of faith, usually men. I don't remember very many women.
You wouldn't have seen any
No,
women rabbis back then, I don't think.
no, but that was so in my mind growing up. The civil rights movement was founded and fought, even though it was passive, but fought by Blacks and Jews together. And for the
Mm.
Jews, I felt the Jewish people that were involved, we were the cause. The plight of Black
Mm-hmm.
Americans was the cause worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
How do you
Yeah, I
see
would
that?
love to talk about that. I mean, I grew up with stories of my father telling us that before he met my mom, I mean, I think he like dropped out of college and went down to Mississippi to help register Black Americans to vote. He was down there. He was thrown in jail. He worked with Stokely Carmichael. He actually has
Mm.
a play that he produced and wrote, and I have to say directed, in Seattle, and it's going to be have a reading in New York, actually at the Lambs Club,
Mm.
about his relationship with Stokely Carmichael and about going to jail, the young women and men that he was with, because he actually wrote notes and a journal on his cigarette carton that he saved. And so he had some quotes. And my father is a writer too, as you can see. And my father, something I want to also say, well, let me get back to that, about passing. See, I'm not going to get back to it. I'm going to say it right now. For my whole life, I thought, why is my dad so into being Jewish? Like, it's not that he's devout and thinks about God all the time, but he's very culturally and historically Jewish. He always talked about World War II. He always talked about the Holocaust. He showed us what we needed to know. He would say to us, and it can happen again, girls. And I
Mm.
remember thinking, what is this guy talking about? I'm living in the 80s. That's black and white back then. Like, what is he talking about? These old movies, these machine guns, and what is going on here? Nazis. I did not believe him. So when October 7th happened and when everything started to, change in a way that Jews are feeling, which is like, oh, you really still don't like us. Like, I thought that was over. I thought we were in the good times, but oh no, actually, we're not safe. I was like, oh my gosh, my father was right. And so my father wrote this play to talk about how by the end of his time in Mississippi, Stokely Carmichael had said, look, it's time for you Jews, you white Jews from the North, to go home. We have to do this on our own now.
Mm.
It's time for Black Americans to do this on our own. And that's kind of where the play ends, because there was a time of holding hands and helping each other. And I think that James Baldwin wrote a lot about, if you read Notes of a Native Son, I remember noticing years ago when I was in my master's program that he writes a lot about the intersection of Jews and Black Americans. And
Mhm.
it's an interesting relationship. It's an interesting dynamic, and it's contentious. And it's also, there's like a brotherhood there. And
Yeah.
so, and I do think that Jews in general are very liberal. There are definitely some Republican Jews, but a lot of Jews fight for progressive causes. A lot of Jews fight for racial justice and equity. And I think that there is a divide. There is a feeling that I don't know what it is. I just don't know what it is. And I think that Jews have often fought for feminism. Jews have often fought for these causes of justice. And I think that it's just a funny thing to think where we are now, post Black Lives Matter. And I don't want to paint anything with one brush ever. That's actually something I try not to do in my work at all. I think there's so much nuance and that comes across when I talk to people and when I write, when I podcast. I'm just sort of taking a section of time and thinking about it. But I do want to say about my father, about passing. This is something we were talking about just a minute ago with your sons. I wondered after October 7th, I was at dinner with two Jewish friends of mine I hadn't seen in a while. They wanted to go to dinner, and we sat quietly and they were talking about current events, and their voices got really low, really low. And I thought, are they worried that someone at this restaurant's going to know we're Jewish? And then we got into the conversation about passing or not passing, which I hadn't thought about myself very much, maybe subconsciously. And they said, well, all of us, we can pass, is what they said.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, what does that mean? And can I? And then I thought about my father, who absolutely cannot pass. My father is Jewish. Like, everything about my father is Jewish. And I wondered, is that why he so embraced this Jewish education and identity and history and causes like the Seattle Jewish play group that he has, the theater, because he cannot hide. What's he going to do? And it just made me think about that a little bit. Like, what's my role as a Jewish American woman? What do I do? Yeah. So that's part of the reason why I'm here to talk with you.
That's fascinating. I mean, I've never heard of passing except for in two communities. I've heard of it in the Black community where people can pass for either racially ambiguous or white, and in the LGBTQ community where people can pass for straight. And so I've heard of it, and I've never heard of it.
I never heard of it either.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, there's a movement in the Black community and maybe in the LGBTQ community as well. But to make passing passé and to embrace, wholeheartedly who we are, because then we're playing into that narrative that's not true, that we are less than if we are. And to claim that power of who we are is a really powerful thing. It is empowering to say, I'm a Black woman, I'm a Black woman with Jewish children, and I'm proud of all these identities, and do not come for me. Don't do it. And I'm in a relationship with a white man who could not pass for anything but white. And, I couldn't,
Scott.
but, I couldn't pretend that Scott was anything other than white, and I wouldn't want to. This is who we are. This is who I fell in love with. And I really, what I've heard is this desire to be proud, but a society that's not quite there yet. And the society that's not ready to embrace, a Jewish Israeli woman as she is, a Black woman with biracial kids, in a relationship with a white man as she is yet. But there's a desire there, I think.
I think that, it's also like, I live in a city, you live in a city. I've lived in cities before. We're kind of lucky in that sense, because I don't live in a place I live in places where there's a lot of liberal people, where there's a mix of people that I mix with, right? And so I don't know what it's like to be a Jew like me elsewhere. I do know that, I used to joke about like, oh, come over, I'll feed you, I'm a Jew, that's what we do. Or, oh, of course, I'm going to like cut up fruit for my son. He's my little prince, like, joking like that. But, I do it tongue in cheek. And it's also kind of true. There are things that are true. Like every time my sister calls me when I'm not expecting it, I pick up the phone and I go, what's wrong? Yeah. And my husband thinks it's so funny, but it's true. We all do it. I don't know why. It's, generational trauma. But, I guess what I want to say is like, I would love to be in a place where I could tell anyone without worrying, right? And
Yeah.
I still know that I have privilege. I still understand that I have privilege. I'm not equating my experience with anyone else's experience. I'm just saying that it's a reminder about how small our community is. And I want to, can I read? I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to say my friend wrote to me something about, I asked her how she's feeling, and she said she's a New York Jew, a lawyer.
Hmm.
She said, I would say that it's very lonely and isolating being a liberal American Jew in 2024. In general, as relates to issues other than Israel, I would align with liberals and progressives, but the partnership between BLM and the Palestinians has unfortunately changed that, at least as relates to this issue. And at the same time, I don't feel any kinship to the pro-Israel Republicans, who I see as using the Jewish community to further their own agenda in the culture wars. And as a person who lived in Israel in the 1990s, when they came so close to peace, it's so disappointing that it seems to not really be on the table in recent years. It's hard not to feel hopeless about the situation.
Wow. That hits. That whole thing that she wrote really hits, and
Yeah.
it actually leads me into my next discussion point. So the New York Times
Yeah.
reports that there is a coalition of Black faith leaders. So faith leaders, are, well, they're pastors, but the Black faith community are usually older Black Americans, church going Americans, and that's the community. Their community is the church community. It is
Mm-hmm.
where politicians target when they want to reach the Black vote. So
Mm-hmm.
the New York Times write there is a coalition of Black faith leaders, more than 1,000 pastors representing hundreds of thousands of congregants, pressuring the Biden administration to push for a ceasefire, a campaign spurred by the parishioners who are increasingly distressed by not only the suffering we see in Gaza, but Biden's response to it.
Hmm.
And so, where we are now in history kind of is 4 years ago, Black voters won the presidency for Biden in South Carolina when Reverend Clyburn came to the podium and said,
Mm-hmm.
we need to vote for this man. And then Black women came out and pushed the
Mm-hmm.
vote all the way through Georgia. And,
Like they always do, like the
like they
Black women
always
always
do.
do. Yeah.
And Biden is running on that again. Like he said, you got me the presidency. This is now at stake for
Mm-hmm.
him. And so I'm curious as to how it feels for you to have been in, I remember you during the summer of 2020 and how vocal you were in support. And I don't want to limit it to the Black Lives Matters movement,
Mm-hmm.
but just to the compassion for Black Americans and
Mm-hmm.
what we as a whole were experiencing then, not necessarily violence directed toward us like me. I didn't have any of that, but I felt the weight of it
Yeah.
all, and I felt
Yeah.
unsafe. And I was scared for my two Black presenting sons like I'd never been scared before. And I remember you being vocal then in support of all of us and the movement itself. So I wonder how this feels for you now.
Mm-hmm.
In 2024. What are we,
Mm-hmm.
5 months post
Yeah. Yeah.
October
Well,
7th?
I kind of stopped doing math a long time ago, but let me try. I think it's like 4 months. Yeah.
4 months.
4 months.
Okay.
4 or 5 months. Yeah, that's right.
And
Yeah.
so tell me how that feels
Well,
for you.
I just want to thank you so much for that question, Laura. And I think it's so important. And lots of thoughts. I will try to keep them in a very streamlined form so I don't go over. I want to thank you for your recognition and just for your noticing. And I had forgotten about some of that and about my actions. And I'm glad that I appeared to you, that resonated with you. I Here's the thing. I have no desire for Israel to bomb Gaza. And most Jews I know would like the ceasefire. Like I don't want to see all of what I've seen. And I cannot understand. I can't fathom how many lives have been lost. It's absurd. And also, I don't know why it's been like this. Like, I just wish none of this had happened this way. None of it. I don't agree. I don't agree with any of it in a way. And there are a lot of Jews who are absolutely ceasefire. I don't believe that ceasefire means you don't care about the state of Israel. Like, I just don't. This is an incredibly sticky situation that no one's been able to untangle since Israel became a nation. Like, it's just awful. It's awful over there. The entanglement and the Nakba and how everyone lays claim to this land. I do want to say a couple of things. I'm going to circle back onto the leaders, the faith leaders.
Wait, you just said a word that I don't know. Did you say
Oh, the Nakba?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Nakba is it's the great catastrophe that Palestinians reference as to when they no longer lived in Israel. And there's, yeah. So sorry, I'll just pick up. Yeah. Okay. So I know you're going to edit. I'm sorry. I'm being silly. So I want to say something when it comes to ceasefire and Israel, those can coexist in my opinion. When it comes to Palestinians and Israelis and Jews, I believe they should be able to coexist. I am anti-Hamas. I am anti-destruction of lives. I'm anti-jihad. Period. I am pro-life and pro-peace and pro-safety for the people who live near each other. That doesn't mean it can happen. In terms of the faith leaders, so I want to mention that if, Black Lives Matter and 60% of Israeli citizens are Mizrahi Jewish, which means they come from Egypt and Persia and Lebanon and Syria, and they come from Libya and Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia. Like, this is not like this idea of like colonizing white people in Israel is really an oversimplification. And I want to say that I pulled a piece of information that I wanted to share, that in a post-Black Lives Matter world, any conflict can be explained with an oppressor-oppressed narrative: man, woman, white, black, Israel, Palestine. And the worldview is based on a postmodern French philosophy that likes to dismiss cause and blame everything on flaws that are inherent in the structure of society. The only solution then is that you tear down the society itself. But if we look at the cause and effect of what's going on in Israel, Israel built a fence not out of a racist agenda, but because terrorists were blowing themselves up in the second Intifada. So I just want to make sure these things are not equal. They're not the same. So the fraught Israel-Palestine relationship has causes. It's not just that Israel is like a settler colonial state that's hell-bent on cleaning the land. In fact, Hamas, one of the tenets in their whole existence is to drive all the Jews into the sea. So that's why from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That means get rid of all the Jews. So I am all with everyone for a ceasefire. And I do worry for Biden because black faith leaders, black people in America will be heard, and they should be heard, and they have been heard in the past. And I think he's in a really sticky spot. I still think we can have a ceasefire. I would like Netanyahu to stop hurting anyone who lives in Gaza. I would like other countries to participate in extinguishing Hamas and not offering safe haven for them. I would like people who march for freedom to understand that everyone deserves freedom and that they should also be anti-Hamas because it is the Muslim Brotherhood. It's like imperialist and it's an offshoot of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think that there is a way that people could hopefully see that Jewish people, Israeli people are lives that were lost. They matter as much as the other lives that are being lost. And we should try to find a way to come together with the UN to fortify Israel's safety and to help the Palestinians. That doesn't involve just Israel taking on the weight of an entire people who other Arab countries haven't absorbed either.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, that was gorgeous. Everything that you just said, you articulated it so well. And, I heard emotion creeping into your voice because it's a very emotional issue. But I think you were really clear. I have a better understanding. And I do want to underscore the difference between Hamas and the Palestinian people, which you did beautifully. I just want to underscore it again because I think there are so many things that are conflated. Hamas and Palestine are conflated. Israel
and all Jews
are conflated.
And
And
Israel and Netanyahu are conflated.
yes, yes. And those things, as you said, need to be untangled and addressed separately. And I was going to ask you to close this out, what your wish was moving forward, but I think you just gave it to us. Um,
Yeah, and I think
yeah,
that what it comes down to is sort of what you're doing here on the show. What I think both of us do in our work, which is, oh, can we please listen to each other just a little bit? Can we please try, just try to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and understand something we didn't know before? If you go into an exchange or a conversation or anything open, vulnerable, willing to learn, curious, you might learn something and change a little bit inside and be a better person for it.
yeah. And the politicizing of all of this for gain, um, I think it's really a shame because these are real people's lives. This is real people's safety, and for it to be for a cause, for an agenda, for political gain is it's really nefarious. I think that I've seen it before throughout history, but it
Oh,
seems more
yes.
acute now.
It does. And I don't know if it's the spread, on social media and how much we're so universally connected. But I do want to say, for further resources, I would like to just shout out rootsmetals.com she does a lot of work on education, Israel's beginning, Judaism, anti-Semitism. I got some of my stuff there, and I would highly recommend the podcast Making Sense with Sam Harris, particularly
Yes.
episode 343 and 351, What is Islamophobia? And 5 Myths About Israel and the war in Gaza. And I
Mm,
also strongly encourage you to listen to Ezra Klein. But I just feel like educate yourself, learn from the other side as well.
yeah. Yeah. Well, and you and I mean, we probably look like we're on opposite sides if you just look at us, but we're not.
Mm-mm.
I consider you a peer and a colleague and an ally and a friend.
Oh,
And again, I just so appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with me. Not everybody would be this courageous. You and I didn't talk a lot about what the conversation would contain, and so I think that was an act of bravery. I think you knew that I wasn't going to come on and like try to get you with anything,
Mm-mm, no.
but just to have this conversation and for public ears,
Oh,
is a courageous act, and I think it's going to help so many people. I really do. I think
I
there's going to
really
be a
hope so.
well, I don't see how anybody could listen to it and not come away with either a different or a better understanding, honestly.
Laura, I want to thank you, and Scott, you too, and Laura particularly, because you just said all those beautiful, beautiful ways that you think about our relationship, and I
Mm.
feel the exact same. And I kind of feel like pinching myself. How did I get so lucky to meet you and connect with you? Well, Sarah Dean,
Sarah
obviously.
Dean.
But we should play a drinking game with her name. But
Yes.
I just am so grateful, like this, giving us space, giving voice. That's also what we do. And
Hmm.
it nurtured me today to talk with you and to hear your kind thoughts and your words and your perspective on how we know each other, and that you are my ally and I am yours. And I'm just
Yes.
absolutely brimming and grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show, Ronit.
Thank you for having me.